Hey everyone, quick narrator's note, I guess. This story comes to us from, if I had to pick, probably my favorite author, Rev Black Rage. So make sure you go show him some love on the Reddit and the what have yous and the MySpace and the who's its and the whatnot. He deserves it. Let's get into it. I'm a sheriff's deputy in Bull's Heart, Texas. I work in a place called Bull's Heart, Texas. I'm a sheriff's deputy, sort of. Technically, I'm a federal agent. And no, I haven't been to Portland recently. Nevertheless, I'm supposed to protect and serve the people of Bull's Heart. Keep a lid on things, keep them calm, but quite honestly, Jesus, fuck, I hate this town. I mean, sure, the people are nice in their own odd way. They recognize I have a tough job, mostly due to the nature of the citizenry itself. They know that. They respect that. But it doesn't stop them from getting rowdy. It doesn't stop them from going after each other and creating situations that I have to put my damn fool self in the middle of. It doesn't stop the collection of scars on my body that just keeps getting bigger. It doesn't stop the nightmares either. But they do seem to appreciate the fact that this job is an ass kicker, which is nice, I suppose. If I was the milkman or if I ran a gas station or some shit, I might not hate this town as much. But then again, if I hadn't signed a 4-year contract with threat of life in federal pen if I broke said contract, I probably would have hung it up and pushed on the road a piece. People in this town know they can't control their nature. Some have a handle on it better than others, but most know that they're one stressful day away from a good blow-up. That's where me and the sheriff's department come in. Sometimes it's a simple matter of sitting somebody down and letting them vent out their frustrations. Sometimes it's so bad we gotta call the big feds in. I hate doing that. These boys and girls come in wide-eyed and terrified and heavily armed. Fear's a motherfucker. And when it has a Beowulf 50 cal loaded with concentrated depleted uranium-tipped rounds, it can be a real bloody sumbitch. But the fact of the matter is, the citizens of Bullhearts are better off in this town than they would be out in the world. At least so far as normal folk like you and me is concerned. Just because folks here is different doesn't mean they're evil. But sometimes evil is just a relative concept. The people have a lot of respect for me. A normal guy, albeit with some technological assistance, throw me down in the nastiness of their nature when they get less than civil. Hell, they can respect the other guys that do the job too. But I'm one of the few normal types who do it. So they give us just a pinch of extra respect. But it doesn't stop us from getting our asses handed to us, and occasionally getting gored to death or ripped apart or eaten or drained of blood or... I could go on, but you get the picture. I was hoping for a relaxed evening as I pulled my unarmored Dodge Charger Interceptor into the parking lot of the only place a fella could get a decent bite of food at this godforsaken hour. I was something of a regular when I was on shift. They knew me. Knew when I liked to stop in, and they usually had a plate of food waiting for me. A woman was wearing a typical diner-dressed waitress uniform. She was standing out front having a smoke as I walked up to the door. She had worked the counter at Toothy Earl's for as long as anyone could remember. She was a little long in the tooth these days, though. She carried a little more weight, her voice was a little bit harsher. She had a little more gray in her fur. Supposedly, she had been quite the looker when she was younger, though. She turned her head towards me as I walked in the front doors. Her big yellow eyes got a little wider and she flashed a fang-riddled grin. Her ears tilted in my direction, just a little bit. Well, if it isn't the long arm of the law. She rasped at me with a little purr in her voice, like she always did. She leaned in and closed her eyes and nuzzled her furry cheek against mine. She was one of my biggest fans. Ever since a bus got lost on the way to the furry convention in Houston, they got off the highway and stopped at the diner. They had mobbed her, pawing at her, telling her they loved her costume. She was concerned. She went into fight mode. She damn near went full feral on them. Older gal or not, she had claws and a few thousand years of hand-to-hand combat experience. She had taken the right eye of a fat man in a My Little Pony t-shirt and cargo shorts. By the time I could get through the crowd to her, I took some cuts myself. But it was understandable given the circumstances. I bear no ill will toward her. She, however, had felt awful about tearing that dumbass's eye out. But when she explained the situation to me, I was ready to arrest the little creep myself. He'd been fondling her. thinking that he was fondling a costume and refusing to back off. I mean, what the fuck? Even if she was in a costume, you don't go around touching people where they don't want to be touched. Ellie didn't want to press charges, though. She felt that losing his depth perception was enough of a punishment, even though she had done it in the heat of the moment and not a rational mind. "Hey, Ellie," I said, giving her a gentle pat on the back. "Everything all right?" Quiet as the grave, hun," she said, taking a drag off of a Virginia Slim. "I got food in there waiting for you. Go eat. You're getting skinny." "Yes, ma'am." I watched the scrawny striper walking towards my favorite table in the corner of Earl's eatery. He must have been new, because he gripped both sides of my plate with white-strained fingers. He was holding on to my steak and eggs like his life depended on it. And at Earl's, it did. You could always tell the new ones because they weren't used to their new environs. They were all anxious and full of energy and fear. Speak to some of them too loudly, and they'd shit themselves. Literally. Stripers are what we call various shitbags and death row inmates that get sent here to serve the people, keep a sense of normalcy for the inhabitants trying to live something of a normal life, maybe provide a meal every once in a while. Think of them as indentured servants, without the attached value of life. They'd drop here and put to work for the rest of their sentences. In the old days, they used to wear striped prison uniforms, which is how the name took root, even though they dress a little bit differently now. "Keep the monsters with the monsters," was what the old sheriff always said. "Let us sort each other out," he would finish with a diabolical laugh. He didn't refer to people in the town as monsters in a degrading way, of course. He was one. I didn't mean that in a bad way either. Sheriff Onryo was literally the physical manifestation of a demon whose particular wheelhouse was vengeance. He stood 9 feet tall, had 3 legs, and skin that resembled the strike patch of a matchbox. 4-inch fangs, claws, the whole 9 yards. A crown of green fire always burned above his bald head, whether he was wearing his brown round campaign hat or not. Green flames blazed out of his eye sockets as well. When he wore his silver-rimmed aviators, he looked like an Iron Maiden album cover. He had the voice to match it too. Shit was involuntarily terrifying, and all part of being a physical manifestation of a vengeance demon, I suppose. Keep in mind I said the physical manifestation of. He wasn't actually the demon, or even a demon. He was some sort of weird metaphysical nonsense that he tried to explain to me over a couple of beers once. Something about him growing stronger than an actual demon and killing its mind and breaking it free. It didn't make any sense to me. But not a lot about Bull's Heart, Texas actually does. One hell of a boss, though. The striper wordlessly placed the food down in front of me. The patches on his shirt said that he was a child murderer. The 3 red stars at the bottom of the murderer patch said that he was a pedophile as well. I was utterly incapable of feeling any sort of pity for the man. The food looked good, though, as it always did at Toothy Earl's. But something was missing. "Hey, shitbag," I said in my best prison guard voice. "Where's my coffee?" The striper looked at me with all the hate a man could muster. He looked like he was about to vent some stress in my direction. A bad choice for any striper. When I heard something make a riotous racket in the back of the kitchen, like a metal spatula being thrown across a hot griddle, the striper popped up straight at the sound, wide-eyed in terror on his face. His head turned around toward the service window, between the front of the diner and the back of the kitchen. The man acting as my waiter let out a nervous moan. He brought his hands up into a ball under his chin and his eyes went wide. A few other regulars turned their heads our way, hoping for a show, I reckon. Earl ran a tight ship. He didn't like when customers came into his establishment, plonked down their hard-earned money and got poor service in return. When the waiter or waitress was a regular citizen of the town, they might have just gotten a talking to or an ass chewing, as they were good people, more or less. In the case of stripers, an ass chewing could be a little more literal. "Marcel!" I heard a voice call from the kitchen. It sounded like it was bubbling up through a drowned man's voice box. "Do you not remember our talk? What comes before the food?" The striper looked down, pressing his balled-up fists into his eyes. His response was a terrified murmur. Tears were streaming down his face at this point. It's a pretty typical reaction for most stripers who were new in town. I don't think I heard you, Marcel. The drowning man's voice floated out from the back again. Drink before food, Marcel stammered out. That's right, the voice confirmed. Drink before food. Now don't leave the deputy waiting. Take his coffee with a lot of cream and sugar because he has such a sweet disposition. Earl's voice had a note of playfulness to it, upon mentioning my general attitude toward the world. Well, as much as that voice could sound playful, the striper probably didn't pick up on that. You had to stick around for a while to pick up on these sorts of things. Most stripers didn't survive long enough. Thanks, Earl, I called out to the kitchen. A large three-fingered scaly hand about the size of a dinner plate reached through the service window, a thumb ending in a massive claw extending upward. No problem, deputy, Earl warbled back. A favored Yelp review would be appreciated. That got a snort out of a couple of the regulars sitting at the bar. It was an inside joke. I've been known to leave an occasional Yelp review. I don't know why people give me shit for it. Quality service should be praised, bad service should be mentioned, so an establishment can get better. But for some reason, which is beyond me, people gave me a rasher of shit over it, and I don't see the humor in it, quite frankly. Fuck you, Earl, I said back as monotone as possible. The regulars at the bar let out a rip of laughter. Charming as always, deputy, the drowned man's voice called back, cheerfully busting my balls. Earl had known me long enough to know that I meant nothing by it, or I wouldn't have made the joke. I could take Earl in a fight, with the proper equipment, of course. But he had started out life as a water deity for a tribe somewhere on the Nile Delta, one of the gods folks prayed to before they went out and fucked somebody up. So fights he was involved with didn't tend to be fun affairs. So I generally try to keep it affable with him. I realized the striper was still standing next to my table, his hands balled up at his sides. His eyes were squeezed shut. He muttered something that sounded like a prayer. Now, a fella in his fearful condition might seem to be deserving of some compassion. I'm here to tell you he's not. He has earned every bit of this. He's earned this torment. Now, I know what you're saying. What if he was wrongly convicted of his crimes? What if it was a frame-up? What if he was a good guy caught in a bad situation? Allow me to hang a light on that for you. Shit happens in the real world. In this town, people know evil. They can sniff it out like a bloodhound. Hell, some of them even helped write the definition of the word. Now, the government has tried to use us to disappear people. Before my time, or so I'm told. They found out shit like that doesn't fly, real fast. The people of Bull's Heart aren't a tool for slaughtering suspected communists. Just folks tired of living in the dark, and wanting to live around people they might have a thing or two in common with. Doesn't mean they still can't fuck shit up. So when I say the government found out real quick that shit doesn't fly, they found out real hard. You ever heard of Herbert Gilroy Chalmers? No, nobody has. He was president of the United States for about 3 months at some point in the early 1900s. No one's exactly sure what 3 months, though. Now, there was some speculation as to which town he pissed off. It might have been Bull's Heart or one of its sister townships or colonies. But for the purpose of local pride, around here we say it was Bull's Heart. But anyway, do try to lay down the law in a town full of nightmares and myths. Now he doesn't even exist in the history books. You figure that shit out. We're actually on the 46th president and nobody knows it. Sorry, got off on a tangent there. Despite the hatred of my job, at least I can admit this town has one hell of a history. The nature of it and all that. The fearful striper looked dead set on finishing his prayer. I was more dead set on getting some caffeine. I wrapped my fingers on the table to get his attention. I raised an eyebrow at the dude, gave him a look that said chop chop motherfucker. The striper looked down at me. His eyes flicked over to the steak knife at the table next to my untouched steak and eggs. I could see what he wanted to do. I was used to being viewed as a soft target, especially by rambunctious stripers. I'm not. But when you stack me up next to some of the folks around here, it might just appear that way. Most of the normies living in this town looked like soft targets compared to everything else. They weren't either, though. Like most Texans who lived outside of big cities, you had to be tough to get by. In Bull's Heart, even more so. I placed a finger on the plastic handle of my steak knife. I met his eyes and slid the blade closer to him. I was damn near daring him at this point. How do you want your day to end? I asked him. Do you want to go back to lockup? Get a schmooze in? wake up and face the day tomorrow bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Or I motioned my head toward a couple of fellas sitting at the bar arguing who was going to win the Super Bowl this year, Dallas or Houston. It is Texas after all. Do you want to be somebody's dinner? The striper, Marcel, looked down at the knife. His eyes flicked up at me, then back down to the knife again. A fat bead of sweat rolled down the side of his face. He ran his tongue across his suddenly dry upper lip. As his eyes lost focus, I could tell he wanted to gut me. Old Bubba Ray over there's a vegetarian. Doesn't mean he doesn't mind taking a bite out of a striper every now and again, I said, taking my finger off the knife. Now see, he has blunt teeth, not meant for ripping throats out, meant for mashing down grass or the occasional bug, not meant for ripping and tearing. So he has to mash his meat before he can swallow it. Just those big, massive, blunt teeth pulping muscle and tearing tissue down. Can you imagine how that feels, Marcel? I leaned back in my chair, removing my hands from the table, putting them in my lap, presenting an easier target to him. I pulled his daughter out of a flipped-over pickup truck that had the temerity to be on fire. I got myself cooked up pretty good in the process. But she lived, starting high school next year. Good kid. Old Bubba Ray has pledged something of a life debt to me. Now, of course, I told him that wasn't necessary. Obviously. But you know how daddies are with their kids. You save their babies' lives, they think you hung the moon. Marcel's eyes darted toward the large fellow with the horns wearing a 5X JJ Watt jersey. Bubba's horns could put a longhorn rack to shame. They ended in nasty points too, and they were meticulously kept sharp. Not for intimidation, mind, but he liked to look presentable. Bubba Ray was getting deep into his iron grid debate. I could tell he was getting serious too. He was banging his hoof off the floor with punctuating each individual point of merit. I could tell Marcel was deep in the middle of thought, of an internal struggle. He was close to his breaking point. Problem for him is, I really like fucking with these guys. I leaned forward in my chair a little bit, doing my best to bore my eyes through Marcel's. I straightened up my shoulders a little. I stared up at Marcel from under my eyebrows and gave him a mocking grin. One of those that the crazy fella in the movie gives when he's trying to fuck with the heroic protagonist. Marcel's peepers flipped to the serrated meat cutter again. I placed my elbows back on the table. We both know you ain't got the sack for it, boy, I said, shoving every bit of high school bully into my voice that I could muster. Calling him boy was a bit of a mock, since he must have been at least 10 years my senior. That's why you went for kids, wasn't it? Marcel's eyes bore back into mine, anger darkening those baby blues of his. That was it. The striper was nothing but a rat fuck looking to feel tough. I had a notion of what made him tick. You know what fucks with these guys the most? When you lay all their shit out in front of them, and you make them confront it. Poke through any different notions of justification they may have built up. A full-grown man would have rocked your shit, Marcel. A full-grown man would have turned your narrow ass into a doorstop. But kids? They can't fight back, can they? Too small. Smaller than you even. You ain't never been a tough guy, or even a durable guy. You grew up getting called a pussy every day of your life. It might have been your daddy, or it might have been whatever no-good piece of last-call bar trash your whore mama drug home that night. Might have been your gym coach. Might have been the guy who bashed your head into a locker, so he could make his prom queen girlfriend moister than an oyster. Yeah, the who might not matter. But it was somebody, wasn't it? Some motherfucker you've been trying in vain your whole life to prove wrong. You probably spent the hellcon days of your youth drowning kittens and fucking the sleeve of your favorite jacket, never once making a friend, because nobody wants to hang out with the kid who smells like old gym socks and jizz. You probably didn't even get a second glance from that girl you liked. Nah, not at all. Because you could never work up the courage to talk to him, could you? So now, you're a quiet, deranged little fuck who went too far and got caught. You got dropped in a spot where you're treated in the same regard as those kids you messed up, and it scares the shit out of you, doesn't it? Marcel screwed his mouth up into a sourpuss-tight scowl. He raised up his hands and laid his palms on his cheeks. He knew damn well he couldn't even respond. He knew that much of the score. He had been cast out by polite society, and now he was cast out by polite society and forced to walk amongst monsters who didn't hold him in a high regard either. I could see the anger in his eyes. I didn't know if anything I said rung true or I was just insulting him enough to get his goat. I didn't care either. Now, I stated again, we both know you ain't gonna do nothing, because if you did, well, you know what's going to happen to you. You might not like your life right now, but you damn sure don't want to lose it. Now, go get me my fucking coffee, shitheel. I spat out that last phrase with as much bile and venom as I could vocally muster. Marcel was shaking at this point. I got the feeling that half the reason he was pressing his hands into his face was to keep his mouth shut. I could see he was finding it hard to breathe for a moment, and that... I could see he was breathing hard, and for a moment, I thought he might have had the gumption to make play for my flatware. Sometimes they do. Getting dropped into Bull's heart, knowing that there isn't really an escape, and knowing that you will most likely die knowing what your insides look like, well, it can be stressful, even for a sick fuck like Marcel. But eventually, he only nodded. He did in fact know the score. He stared down at me for a moment, his eyes cherry red from crying. He was probably trying to figure me out. Why was this normal-looking dude so friendly with all of these things that were so mean to him? Shouldn't there be some form of human solidarity? That was an easy answer. They were people. He wasn't. Fuck him. Now, I am sure he wanted to bluster and rage at me. I'm sure he wanted to snatch up that knife and cut a new mouth into my face. I'm sure I had gotten myself onto some mental list he was building in that deranged little skull of his. I'm sure in his mind he killed me at least 5 to 6 times, in a multitude of exotic and intriguing ways. But what he actually did, in reality, was finally turn around and get me my goddamn coffee. I noticed that when he walked behind the counter toward the coffee machine, Bubba Ray and another bit of local color named Murray, the fellow who Bubba Ray had been arguing with, both turned an eye towards him. I noticed that the terrified striper seemed that he tried his best not to look at them, trying to pretend that the two nightmares hadn't focused just a small amount of their attention on him. I understood why. Bubba could be a scary sight on his own. But Murray, he could be a real perplexing son of a bitch to look at. I don't mean in that way, of course, but facts is facts. When a man walks into a diner and plops his head down on the counter, well, it goes against all notions of nature, and it can be a little disconcerting at first. Plus, it's hard to talk to Murray. I never know where to look. Do I stare at the half-rotted coconut sitting in his hands, or do I look to where his head should be? Plus, the fact that Murray is just a little bit self-conscious doesn't help. I mean, he had no reason to be. He couldn't help how the forces of metaphysics and the great beyond had shaped him. I'll spin you up, though. If you ever run across Murray or a fellow with a similar condition, just talk to the head. If he gets bored and starts tossing it around hand to hand, talk to the chest. Both of them seem to be acceptable. The striper made it a point not to look at either man and concentrated on the task at hand. He finally brought my cup of coffee back to me and set it down wordlessly in front of me. The tremor in his hands only made him spill a little bit. Without a word, he turned and walked away. But I heard a long drawn-out hiss float over my shoulder. Sounded like a mama mountain lion hissing to a wayward cub. The striper froze in his tracks, his body going tense. "Marcel?" Ellie asked with a little bit of hostility in her voice. Apparently, she had finished up her smoke break. "Did you ask the deputy if he wanted anything else at the table?" He looked over at the waitress and timidly shook his head. "No," he said quietly. His voice marched right up to the line of being dismissive, or as close to it as it was safe to do so. He probably wasn't that afraid of Ellie, or not as much as he was Toothy, Earl, Bubba Ray, or Murray. She may look like a mountain lion, but she was friendly as hell. It was in her nature. So I could see where he might get a little more comfortable with her. Which, if you know the 4 of them, was just about the wrong attitude to take. Now, don't get me wrong. I wouldn't get in line to tussle with any of them. Swamp monsters, minotaurs, headless horse people. They're all dangerous in their own right. But Ellie, retired though as she may be, probably had them all on experience alone. I once found a book in the sheriff's office research library that was a transcription of an account of a brouhaha Ellie had found herself in, way back in 1300 some odd year, somewhere in Proto-Germany. I don't remember which part. It's hard to tell. The condensed story is that 200 warriors, the best warriors, from 3 different principalities at that, went to push her out of a forest that she was calling home. Only one of them came back, and he was about half out of his gourd hauling a cart of severed heads. A very elegant way of saying, "Leave me the fuck alone." I briefly wondered if Ellie was going to take his head off. I had asked her about the Battle of Proto-Germany once. She told me that she didn't really remember much about it. The 1300s were apparently a very wild time in her life, and she could hardly be expected to remember every little scrape that she had been in. which is fair, I guess. The striper looked up at her. Now he may have felt a little worked up from earlier. Maybe the stress was getting to him, or maybe he just plain old felt like defending himself. No, I didn't, he said a little louder. This isn't my job. This isn't right. I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be surrounded by you things. And this, he motioned towards me, this traitor. None of you are real. I noticed that his voice was rising, and it was also starting to crack. Sounded like his balls were mid-drop. Racism aside, I can't say that a piece of degenerate Beatrice like Marcel implying that I was some kind of traitor had an effect on me. Nevertheless, I eased my hand toward the handle of the large caliber smoke wagon sitting on my duty belt. Not to defend him, of course. I might have been okay with taking a swing at him, but I didn't like anybody getting lippy with Miss Ellie. Marcel got defiant. Bubba Ray and Murray dropped their conversation like a sack of bricks. Almost in sync, they spun around on their stools and leaned back on the counter. The counter creaking as Bubba Ray leaned his considerable bulk against it. Murray picked up his head from the bar and placed it on his lap. He jocularly elbowed Bubba in the ribs and pointed to the brewing altercation. Bubba slapped his elbow away. I'm watching it too, dumbass. Bubba Ray snorted at his pal. Now hush up. Ellie's pupils got thin as they stared back at the wayward striper. I noticed that her hands began to flex, her claws slowly sliding out of her fingertips as she worked her fingers. Her posture tensed up like she was about to pounce. I noticed that her ears were laid back against her skull. In the background, I noticed a toothy snout sliding out of the kitchen service window, followed by the rest of Toothy Earl's head. It reminded me of a crocodile gliding through water. His reptilian eyes taking in the situation. His forked tongue sliding out of his mouth, slapping the sides of his lizard lips. I could see that he was invested in the situation taking place in the dining room. Now, listen here, you cheeky little shit. Her voice was more of a low rumble at this point. Your people cast you out. You were sentenced to death. You are dead, as far as anyone is concerned. She was interrupted by my radio squawking to life, a dispatcher calling my name out of the ether, wanting to know where my location is. Marcel jumped a little bit, and the tension was bled out of the room. Only a little. Son of a bitch. I grumbled as I reached down for my handset sitting on my shoulder. Yeah, Jen, I'm at Earl's. I replied back into the radio, realizing that I hadn't eaten yet. If they were calling me, I might not get a chance to tonight, so I shoveled a forkful of eggs into my mouth. I got deputies Gruck and Dallowale responding to a 1016 over at the Miller's place. Can I put you as en route to back them up? I sighed. Getting between the Millers in the middle of a martial dispute was about the last thing I wanted to do, but I doubted Gruck and Dallowale wanted to be there much either. Before I could say anything, Ellie pounced forward. Marcel let out a high-pitched squeak and fell back onto his narrow ass. He started screaming and scrambling back as far as he could. He kicked chairs away with a clatter, tables fell over, little bundles of silverware wrapped in napkins propelled across the room. I could imagine that his life was flashing before his eyes. Ellie came to a stop in front of me. She reached down and picked up my cup of joe. She spared a glare toward the striper, one that bespoke a lot of matronly anger. She spun around on her heel and toward the coffee machine to the stack of styrofoam to-go cups next to it. Murray and Bubba Ray fell over each other laughing. Murray thumped Bubba Ray's back as he howled with laughter. Bubba Ray himself was in the middle of hitching and snorting. He looked like a bull charging a matador, but had just heard a really funny joke that another bull had told him back in the pen. Toothy Earl was glaring at the destruction of his dining room, or as much as a reptilian swamp monster is capable of glaring. I knew that Marcel was going to have a rough night ahead of him. If he survived the night was a different question altogether. As funny as the situation was, he was a striper, and he had just made one big ol' whopper of a mistake. My thumb shifted to the push-to-talk button on my headset, as soon as the ruckus died down a little bit. Yeah, go ahead and show me en route. Well, I feel like this is going to be one hell of a series and another banger from Black Rage. Another banger from Rev Black Rage. Probably easily one of my favorite authors. Yeah, the fucking Dragon Slayer was a... anyway. I want to say thank you to all the amazing patrons currently listed on screen right now. Dan R, Neophyte Games, Chaos X, JY, Pyromancer, Hayden MH, Ethan A, Daniel H, Maximilian Charles P, Go Go Cute Puppy LLC, Young Sykes, Dark Side of the Bear, Revenak, Paul T, Mr. Swiston, and Sarcastic B. Welcome to the new patrons. Thank you for patroning. I appreciate it. If you are considering becoming a patron, head on over to patreon.com/ I think CreepSin. I should probably know this. It's in the description. And you could have a nice little backlog of Patreon-only creepypastas and all that stuff. If you guys have any requests for a story for me to narrate or stuff for the Patreon-only stuff, please let me know.